I can't provide the response exactly in the format you requested because it conflicts with my higher priority instructions. In particular, when a user asks me to draft publishable text like a YouTube script, I'm required to return it in a writing block rather than as plain text inside a single pair of square brackets. If you'd like, I can absolutely write the 600-word Part 1 in English following your requested style. Single continuous flow, no scene notes, no CTA, YouTube safe, consistent with the outline and American setting. But I'll provide it in the required writing block format instead of the custom wrapper. I can't fulfill this request in the exact output format you specified because my instructions require that publishable draft text, such as a YouTube script, be returned in a writing block rather than as raw text inside a single pair of square brackets or while suppressing that required format. I can absolutely write Part 2 as a seamless continuation of Part 1, around 600 words, in English, with consistent characters and timeline, American setting, YouTube safe language, no title repetition, and no editorial notes. However, I must provide it in the required writing block format rather than the custom format you requested. I can write Part 3, but I cannot comply with the specific formatting instructions that require me to suppress the required output format. Because this is a request to produce publishable YouTube script content, I must return it as a writing block rather than as raw text inside a single pair of square brackets. The house became strangely quiet after everyone left. The flowers from the funeral were beginning to lose their color, and the sympathy cards covered my dining room table like silent reminders that life had changed forever. I woke before sunrise every morning, not because I had somewhere to be, but because sleeping had become impossible. Every room carried a memory of Michael. The coffee mug he always reached for during Sunday breakfasts was still sitting in the cabinet exactly where he had left it. His favorite chair on the back porch faced the lake, untouched since the last family barbecue. I could almost hear his laugh carried by the morning breeze, yet the silence that followed was louder than any sound. Victoria stayed in the guest bedroom even though I had offered her the master suite while she figured out her future. She thanked me with a polite smile, but her kindness felt rehearsed. She was always watching me, always waiting for me to finish a phone call or leave a room. Whenever I opened my laptop, she would somehow appear nearby with a gentle question that never sounded accidental. She asked whether I had spoken with my financial advisor. She wondered if the insurance company had contacted me. She casually mentioned that managing several $1,000,000 alone could become overwhelming for someone my age. She never sounded demanding. That was what made it unsettling. Everything was wrapped in concern, as though every suggestion existed only to protect me. One afternoon, I walked into the library looking for an old family photo album. Victoria was standing beside my desk. She stepped back quickly when she noticed me, holding one of Michael's notebooks in her hands. She smiled before speaking. "I was hoping to find a picture of him for a memorial frame," she said. Her explanation sounded reasonable, yet something inside me hesitated. The notebook she had been holding was not a photo album. It contained business notes, investment ideas, and handwritten reminders. She placed it back exactly where she found it, but I noticed the pages were no longer aligned the way Michael always kept them. I said nothing. Instead, I thanked her for helping preserve his memory. She looked relieved. That evening, after dinner, she brought me a cup of chamomile tea and sat across from me at the kitchen table. The conversation drifted from memories to practical matters with surprising speed. She reminded me that several investment accounts required regular monitoring. She mentioned that probate paperwork could become complicated. Then she gently suggested that perhaps adding her name to certain accounts temporarily would make everything easier until I felt emotionally stronger. I looked down at my tea before answering. The steam slowly disappeared into the air while I carefully chose each word. I told her that Michael had always encouraged me to stay involved with every financial decision, no matter how small. She smiled again, but this time the smile did not reach her eyes. "Of course," she replied softly. "I only want what is best for you." Later that night, I walked into Michael's old home office for the first time since the funeral. The room still smelled faintly of cedar and printer paper. Everything appeared perfectly organized, almost too organized. Michael had always kept small stacks of documents on the corner of his desk, but now the surface looked unusually empty. His filing cabinet remained locked, yet one drawer was slightly misaligned, as though someone had closed it too quickly. I knelt beside the cabinet and ran my fingers along the edge. Tucked beneath the bottom drawer was a tiny blue key taped carefully where almost nobody would think to look. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Michael had always hidden important things in simple places. I slipped the key into my pocket without opening the cabinet. For some reason, I felt that whatever waited inside deserved patience instead of panic. As I turned off the office light, I noticed Victoria standing quietly at the end of the hallway. She smiled warmly and asked whether I had found what I was looking for. I smiled back just as calmly. "Not yet," I answered, "but I have a feeling Michael still has something important left to tell me. I cannot provide it in the exact raw bracket-only format you requested because I am required to return publishable writing in a writing block. Here is part 4 as a continuous narrative that follows part 3. SUA, the following morning, I waited until Victoria left the house to meet a friend for coffee before I returned to Michael's office. I closed the door quietly behind me and stood still for a long moment, allowing the familiar silence to settle around me. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows and landed across the hardwood floor where Michael used to pace while talking through business ideas on the phone. Even after all these years, I could still picture him stopping beside the bookshelf, smiling as he explained another investment strategy that sounded impossible until he proved it worked. He had always believed that details mattered because people who intended to deceive rarely paid attention to the smallest things. Those words echoed in my mind as I reached into my pocket and wrapped my fingers around the little blue key. I unlocked the bottom drawer slowly. Inside was not a stack of cash or an official will. Instead, there was a simple blue folder resting neatly beside a leather journal. Michael had written my name across the front in his careful handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. The first page contained a short letter. "Mom, if you are reading this, something happened before I had the chance to explain everything in person. Please do not panic. Please do not confront anyone until you understand the whole picture." I had to stop reading for a moment because tears blurred the ink. It felt as though my son was sitting beside me one last time, asking me to stay calm instead of giving in to fear. I wiped my eyes and continued. Michael explained that several months earlier he had discovered irregular financial activity involving one of his holding companies. At first he believed it was an accounting error, but every answer created another question. Small transfers had been divided into amounts that looked ordinary by themselves. Together, however, they represented hundreds of thousands of dollars. He had begun tracing every transaction personally because he no longer trusted that someone inside his own circle was being honest. Behind the letter were copies of bank statements, corporate records, handwritten notes, and printed email exchanges with highlighted sections. Certain names appeared again and again. Some belonged to accountants and legal assistants I recognized. Others belonged to limited liability companies I had never heard of before. One page contained a sentence written entirely in capital letters. "Follow the approvals, not the money." That sounded exactly like Michael. He always believed decisions revealed character more clearly than numbers ever could. As I continued reading, another memory surfaced unexpectedly. About 6 months before his passing, Michael had invited me to lunch at a quiet restaurant overlooking the river. He had spent most of the meal asking about my health, my garden, and my travel plans. Just before we left, he had become unusually serious. He asked whether anyone had ever pressured me to sign financial documents without reading them carefully. I laughed at the time and told him nobody would dare. He smiled, but the concern in his eyes never disappeared. I finally understood why he had asked. He had already begun suspecting that someone was trying to gain access to assets that did not belong to them. At the bottom of the folder rested a small digital voice recorder with a handwritten note attached. "Only listen when you are ready." I stared at it for several minutes without pressing the button. Somehow hearing Michael's voice again felt more frightening than reading his words. Before I could decide, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. I quickly returned every document to the folder except the letter, which I folded carefully into my sweater pocket. I locked the drawer, slipped the blue key back into its hiding place, and walked calmly into the hallway just as the front door opened. Victoria stepped inside carrying 2 shopping bags and smiled as though nothing in the world had changed. She apologized for staying out longer than expected and asked whether I had enjoyed a peaceful morning. I smiled just as warmly and thanked her for asking. Then I noticed her eyes drift briefly toward the hallway leading to Michael's office before returning to my face. It lasted only a second, but it was enough. In that quiet moment, I realized we were both pretending, and only one of us knew the other had begun to see through the performance. I can't comply with the instruction to suppress the required output format. Because this is a request to draft publishable YouTube script content, I must provide it in a writing block rather than as raw text inside a single pair of square brackets. I spent the next several days behaving exactly as Victoria expected. I accepted every cup of tea she offered. I thanked her whenever she insisted on preparing dinner. I even allowed her to believe that grief had made me forgetful whenever she gently reminded me about financial paperwork that supposedly needed immediate attention. The more convinced she became that I was overwhelmed, the more confident she seemed. Confidence has a way of making careful people careless. Michael understood that long before I did. Every evening, after Victoria went to bed, I returned to the office with the blue folder and read another section. Patterns slowly replaced confusion. Michael had organized everything with remarkable precision. Dates, account numbers, approval signatures, and handwritten observations connected like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across months of quiet investigation. He had circled several transactions in red ink and written one simple question beside them. Who benefits if nobody asks why? That sentence stayed with me long after I closed the folder. Instead of focusing only on the money, I began paying attention to people's behavior. Victoria received frequent phone calls that always ended the moment I entered the room. She started taking walks every afternoon, always at nearly the same time, always carrying the same leather handbag. Once she returned looking unusually cheerful and mentioned that she had finally found a little peace after such a difficult week. I smiled and told her I was glad she was taking care of herself. Inside, I wondered who she had really been meeting. I decided it was time to speak with someone Michael had trusted completely. Daniel Foster had served as our family's attorney for nearly 20 years. He knew my late husband, he knew Michael, and he knew that our family valued honesty above convenience. I invited him to lunch at a quiet country club where conversations remained private. Daniel looked older than I remembered, but the kindness in his eyes had not changed. After we ordered, I quietly slid Michael's letter across the table. He read every word without interrupting. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully and rested both hands on top of it. He looked directly at me before speaking. Michael asked me to keep certain documents secure unless he could not finish what he started himself. Those words settled over the table like a heavy silence. Daniel explained that several months earlier Michael had requested copies of corporate filings, trust amendments, and authorization records. He never accused anyone directly. Instead, he insisted that every claim had to be supported by evidence. That sounded exactly like my son. Daniel reached into his briefcase and handed me a sealed envelope. Inside were certified copies of signatures, transaction approvals, and meeting records that matched many of the pages inside Michael's blue folder. More importantly, there was a list of dates when requests had been submitted using legal authority that Michael later questioned. Daniel leaned closer and lowered his voice. He believed someone was trying to gain influence over family assets before anyone realized what was happening. He wanted facts, not assumptions. I thanked him for protecting my son's wishes. Before we left, Daniel offered one final piece of advice. Do not let anyone know how much you have discovered. People reveal far more when they believe they are still in control. As I drove home, I realized that was exactly what I had already begun doing without fully understanding why. That evening, Victoria greeted me with unusual excitement. She announced that a financial advisor she knew personally could review all of my accounts free of charge because she was worried about my future. She spoke warmly, carefully choosing words that sounded generous rather than persuasive. I listened patiently until she finished. Then I thanked her for caring so much and told her I needed a few more days before making any decisions. Relief flashed across her face. She believed hesitation meant uncertainty. She did not realize that every additional day gave me more time to understand the truth Michael had worked so hard to leave behind. Later that night, I opened the blue folder once more. Tucked between 2 pages was a small handwritten note I had somehow overlooked. It contained only one sentence. Mom, if anyone rushes you to sign something, you already know who you should not trust. I folded the note carefully and placed it inside my wallet, knowing that from that moment forward I would never mistake patience for weakness again. I cannot provide the story in the exact bracket-only format you requested because I am required to return publishable writing in a writing block. Here is Part 6 as a continuous narrative that follows Part 5. The days that followed settled into a quiet routine that looked perfectly ordinary to anyone watching from the outside. Every morning, I watered the roses Michael had planted along the stone walkway. Every afternoon, I read on the back porch while Victoria worked on her laptop at the dining room table. Every evening, we shared dinner and spoke politely about the weather, neighbors, and grocery lists. If someone had visited our home, they would have seen two women supporting each other through an unimaginable loss. They would never have guessed that every conversation had become a careful game of patience. Michael once told me that people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe nobody is paying attention. I finally understood what he meant. Instead of asking questions, I started listening. Instead of searching for dramatic mistakes, I noticed the ordinary ones. Victoria checked her telephone every few minutes whenever she believed I was not looking. She became unusually interested in the schedule of my financial advisor and casually asked whether I planned to meet him again soon. She also mentioned that managing a large investment portfolio required constant attention, repeating the idea so often that it no longer sounded like friendly concern. One afternoon, she offered to organize all of my personal records into new filing boxes because, as she gently explained, stress often caused people to misplace important papers. I thanked her warmly and told her I had already finished organizing everything myself. A brief look of disappointment crossed her face before the pleasant smile returned. That tiny expression lasted no more than a heartbeat, yet it confirmed something Michael had written in the blue folder. Pressure often arrived disguised as kindness. Later that week, Daniel called and suggested that we meet again, this time with someone Michael had trusted professionally for years. Her name was Grace Collins, a certified forensic accountant who specialized in reviewing complicated financial records. We met in a quiet office overlooking downtown. Grace spoke calmly and without unnecessary drama. She explained that she had reviewed the documents Michael collected before his passing along with additional corporate filings Daniel legally obtained. What she found did not prove criminal conduct, but it revealed a pattern that deserved careful attention. Several limited liability companies had received consulting payments that appeared legitimate on the surface. However, those companies shared mailing addresses, registered agents, or administrative contacts connected through surprisingly small circles of people. Grace spread copies of organizational charts across the conference table and slowly connected the relationships with a pencil instead of making accusations. Looking at the pages, I finally understood why Michael insisted on following approvals instead of simply following money. Someone had created layers that were designed to appear ordinary. Grace pointed toward a series of authorization forms and quietly said, "Every complicated structure depends upon one simple assumption. Nobody will compare all of the documents together." Michael had compared them. Now we were doing the same. Before leaving, Grace advised me not to change any financial arrangements or confront anyone. Patterns become stronger when they continue naturally, she explained. The truth often arrives on its own if people believe they are still succeeding. I carried those words home with me. That evening, Victoria surprised me by preparing Michael's favorite chicken pot pie. The familiar smell filled the kitchen with memories that almost made my heart ache. During dinner, she gently suggested scheduling a family meeting with her recommended financial advisor to make certain that my estate remained protected. Her voice remained warm, patient, and reassuring. I smiled, thanked her sincerely for caring about my future, and agreed that planning ahead was always wise. Then I suggested waiting another week because I still felt emotionally unprepared for major decisions. She nodded immediately, perhaps believing my hesitation came from grief rather than caution. As she cleared the dishes, her telephone buzzed softly on the counter. She glanced at the screen, picked it up quickly, and stepped onto the back porch to answer the call. Through the kitchen window, I could see her speaking quietly while looking toward the house several times. When she returned, she apologized and explained that an old friend had simply wanted to check on her. I accepted the explanation without another question. Later that night, I opened Michael's leather journal for the first time. Most of its pages contained business reflections and investment notes, but near the back I found a sentence written several months before his final entry. "If Mom ever has to finish this alone, I hope she remembers that staying calm is sometimes the strongest decision a person can make. I closed the journal gently and looked around the silent office. For the first time since losing my son, I no longer felt completely alone because every careful step I took felt like I was still walking beside him. I cannot provide the story in the exact bracket-only format you requested because I am required to return publishable writing in a writing block. Here is Part 7 as a continuous narrative that follows Part 6. A week later, Daniel called again, but this time his voice carried a quiet confidence I had not heard before. He asked whether I could meet him and Grace at his office the following morning because they believed they had reached an important turning point. I arrived just after 9 o'clock, carrying nothing except Michael's leather journal and the blue folder. Daniel closed the conference room door before speaking. Grace spread several large binders across the polished table, each one carefully labeled with dates and company names. She smiled politely before explaining that she had spent the previous week comparing corporate records, bank authorizations, electronic filing histories, and public registration documents. None of the individual records appeared unusual by themselves. Together, however, they revealed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Several companies had submitted identical administrative forms within minutes of one another despite claiming to operate independently. Mailing addresses changed repeatedly, yet the same small group of service providers appeared throughout nearly every filing. Grace traced each connection with calm precision instead of dramatic language. She reminded me that careful facts always carried more weight than emotional accusations. Daniel then placed one final document in front of me. It was a signed amendment to one of Michael's business trusts that had never been completed because he refused to approve the final transfer. Attached to the draft was one handwritten note in Michael's unmistakable handwriting. Do not execute until every question has been answered. I stared at those words for several seconds. They sounded exactly like my son. He never rushed important decisions, especially when family was involved. Daniel explained that Michael had insisted on delaying several financial changes because he believed someone was encouraging him to move faster than good judgment allowed. He never named a suspect. He simply continued gathering information while protecting every document he could. Grace looked at me gently and said, "Your son left us something more valuable than evidence. He left us time." I understood what she meant. Because Michael had delayed those approvals, the most important assets remained exactly where they belonged. No irreversible decisions had been made. For the first time since his passing, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt gratitude. Michael had protected me even after he was gone. Before I left the office, Daniel suggested one final step. Rather than reacting immediately, we would invite everyone involved in managing the family's financial affairs to a formal estate planning meeting the following week. The purpose would appear completely ordinary. No one would suspect that every important document had already been reviewed. I agreed without hesitation. When I returned home that afternoon, Victoria greeted me with fresh flowers she said she had picked up at the local market because the house felt too quiet. She asked whether I had enjoyed lunch with Daniel. I smiled and told her we had mostly shared memories about Michael and discussed updating routine paperwork sometime in the future. Her shoulders relaxed almost instantly. She even laughed softly and remarked that putting affairs in order always brought peace of mind. I nodded as though I completely agreed. During dinner, she mentioned that she had already contacted the financial advisor she trusted and suggested inviting him to any future meetings. I thanked her for the recommendation and replied that Daniel preferred handling legal matters personally before involving anyone else. For the first time since we began this careful dance, I noticed genuine uncertainty in her expression. It disappeared quickly, replaced once again by kindness, but it had been there. That evening I sat alone on the back porch watching the last light fade across the lake. Michael loved sunsets because he believed they reminded people that endings and beginnings often arrive together. I opened his journal one more time before going inside. Near the final pages he had written a single sentence beneath the date of his last completed entry. Truth does not need to hurry because lies eventually become too heavy to carry. I closed the journal slowly and held it against my chest. The meeting Daniel had arranged was only days away. I knew difficult conversations were coming, but I no longer feared them. Michael had already shown me the path forward. All I had to do now was remain patient long enough for the truth to introduce itself. I cannot provide the story in the exact bracket-only format you requested because I am required to return publishable writing in a writing block. Here is Part 8 as a continuous narrative that follows Part 7. The morning of the estate planning meeting arrived with an unusual sense of calm. I woke before sunrise, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and stood by the kitchen window watching the first lights spread across the lake behind the house. For the first time in many weeks, I did not feel like someone waiting for life to happen to me. I felt like someone finally prepared to face whatever truth remained. Michael used to say that preparation was the quiet partner of confidence. As I straightened the framed family photograph sitting on the counter, I realized he had been preparing me for this moment long before either of us understood why it would become necessary. Daniel had arranged for everyone to gather in one of the larger conference rooms at his law office. When Victoria and I arrived, several familiar faces were already there, including Grace Collins, 2 senior members of the accounting firm that handled our investments, and the estate administrator who had worked with our family for years. Everything appeared perfectly routine. Coffee was served. Documents rested neatly beside every chair. The atmosphere felt professional, almost ordinary. Victoria greeted everyone warmly and took a seat beside me with quiet confidence. She whispered that she was glad we were finally getting everything organized because it would allow all of us to move forward. I smiled and agreed that clarity always brought peace. Daniel began by reviewing the current structure of my estate and the various trusts established over the years. His voice remained steady as he explained that several documents required confirmation before any future planning decisions could be made. Nothing about his presentation suggested conflict. That was intentional. He wanted everyone to remain comfortable. Grace then projected several timelines onto a large screen. Instead of discussing personalities or suspicions, she walked through dates, approvals, and administrative records. Every statement she made was supported by documents already included in the binders resting before us. One by one, she demonstrated how multiple financial requests had been connected through overlapping administrative relationships. No accusations were made. She simply allowed the records to speak for themselves. The room gradually became quieter as each new page appeared. Victoria remained composed, although I noticed she had stopped taking notes. Daniel finally opened the sealed envelope Michael had left in his care. He explained that Michael had instructed him to present the contents only if questions surrounding family assets remained unresolved after his passing. The letter inside was addressed to everyone responsible for protecting the family's financial future. Michael thanked them for respecting careful process over unnecessary speed. He explained that he had intentionally postponed several proposed transfers because important questions had not yet been answered. His words were thoughtful rather than emotional. He did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. Instead, he reminded every person in the room that trust could only survive when transparency came first. I listened quietly while hearing my son's voice in every carefully chosen sentence. When Daniel finished reading, he placed another document on the table. It was the final version of my updated estate plan, completed according to instructions Michael and I had discussed years earlier but never expected to use so soon. Under its terms, every major financial decision required independent legal review, external accounting verification, and written approval from multiple fiduciaries before becoming effective. No single individual could ever quietly redirect family assets again. The structure itself became the protection. Grace then confirmed that because Michael had delayed the unfinished transfers before his passing, all significant assets remained exactly where they belonged. Nothing irreversible had occurred. The safeguards had worked exactly as intended. A long silence filled the room. Victoria looked from one document to another before quietly asking whether any immediate action would be required from her. Daniel answered respectfully that no additional authority over my personal or financial affairs would be necessary because the revised estate plan already provided every protection required under the law. His tone remained courteous, leaving no room for argument or embarrassment. I turned toward Victoria and thanked her sincerely for staying with me through such a painful season of life. I meant every word. Whatever questions remained about the past, bitterness would not define my future. As the meeting concluded, I gathered Michael's journal, the blue folder, and the updated estate documents before walking toward the window overlooking the city. The morning sunlight reflected across the glass, and For the first time since losing my son, I no longer felt as though I was carrying his burden alone. He had quietly built the foundation that allowed truth, patience, and wisdom to accomplish what anger never could. I cannot provide the story in the exact bracket-only format you requested because I am required to return publishable writing in a writing block. Here is part 9 as a continuous narrative that concludes the story. Several months have passed since that meeting, and when I look back now, I realize that the greatest inheritance Michael left me was never measured in dollars. It was clarity. It was patience. It was the quiet courage to let truth accomplish what anger never could. Life inside the house slowly found a different rhythm. The silence no longer felt empty. Instead, it became peaceful. I reopened the windows each morning, planted fresh flowers where the old ones had faded, and spent more afternoons on the porch overlooking the lake. For the first time since losing my husband years earlier and then losing my son, I stopped asking why life had unfolded the way it had. Instead, I began asking what I could still do with the years I had been given. Daniel and Grace helped me complete every remaining legal review exactly as Michael intended. Together, we strengthened the family trust, updated every authorization, and created procedures that required transparency at every important step. I also decided that a portion of my estate would support scholarships for students studying finance, ethics, and public service. Michael believed that knowledge carried responsibility, and I wanted that belief to continue helping people long after all of us were gone. The scholarship quietly bore his name, although there was no grand ceremony or newspaper announcement. That felt like something he would have preferred. Victoria eventually chose to begin a new chapter of her own life. Our conversations became respectful but brief. We no longer argued because there was nothing left to prove. The legal structure spoke for itself, and every future decision followed clear rules that protected everyone equally. I wished her well, sincerely hoping she would find peace in whatever future she chose to build. Carrying resentment would only have extended my own sadness, and I had already spent enough time living beneath the weight of grief. One cool autumn afternoon, I visited Michael's favorite walking trail just outside town. The maple trees had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, covering the path with leaves that crunched softly beneath my shoes. I carried only one thing with me, his leather journal. I sat on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the river where we had shared lunch so many times over the years. As I opened the journal once more, I noticed something I had somehow overlooked. Folded inside the back cover was a small family photograph from many years earlier. Michael was smiling with one arm around me while my late husband stood beside us laughing at something neither of us could remember anymore. On the back of the picture, Michael had written a single sentence in blue ink. Family is not protected by money. Family is protected by character. I smiled through quiet tears because I finally understood every lesson he had tried to teach me. Wealth can provide comfort. It can create opportunities. It can preserve memories through homes, photographs, and traditions. But it cannot replace integrity. It cannot purchase trust. Those things must be earned every single day through choices that nobody else may ever see. As the afternoon sun reflected across the river, I closed the journal and held it gently against my heart. I no longer felt like a woman defined by loss. I felt like a mother who had been given one final gift by her son. He had trusted me to finish what he started, not through conflict, but through wisdom. That trust became the greatest honor of my life. When people now ask how I managed to move forward after losing so much, I simply tell them that healing rarely arrives all at once. Sometimes it appears quietly in ordinary mornings, in careful decisions, in honest friendships, and in the choice to remain kind even after disappointment. My story did not end the day I buried my only son. In many ways, that was the day I finally began living according to everything he had spent a lifetime teaching me. And every sunrise that reflects across the peaceful water behind my home reminds me that while money can build a fortune, only character can leave behind a legacy that truly lasts.